A few months before 74-year-old Leigh Ann Sabine died after battling brain cancer, she told her hairdresser that people were going to talk about her after she passed away because of the body in the bag. It was an alarming statement that mostly went ignored as a wild, silly, made-up story, one of many that Leigh Ann was known for telling. But the true meaning of her words would be revealed about a month after her death when two of her best friends made a gruesome discovery. It was well known that Leigh Ann had kept a fake medical skeleton, one that you might find on display at the doctor's office, that she sometimes liked to place in her garden, move around her house, or keep in her shed. She said it was a keepsake from her nursing days. Her friends thought that it might be funny to use the medical skeleton as a part of a prank, place it on one of their neighbour's doorstep, and ring the doorbell to frighten them. They'd all laugh about it. Instead, they would be the ones frightened when they began to unwrap the medical skeleton and discover a perfectly mummified body. Now, it was Leigh Ann who had the last laugh, as she had seemingly gotten away with murder. Leigh Ann Sabine was locally known as Mad Leigh. She was what we would call extra. She was flamboyant, she dressed for attention, and she always had the wildest of stories to tell anyone who would listen. She was also downright selfish and evil, according to some who knew her. Maybe she was made this way because of her difficult beginnings. Born in Wales, she was abandoned by her mother as a young child and spent much of her early years hopping between the homes of her relatives and foster care. She was never shown love, and so she grew up not knowing how to love others, so the cycle was perpetuated. She did, however, have her ambitions and became a working nurse when she was in her late teens. At just 17 years old, while working at a hospital in London, she would meet her future husband, a 28-year-old man named John, who already had a wife and 2 children waiting for him at home. John worked as an accountant and was a Korean War veteran, and he was smitten with Leigh Ann. She was incredibly confident for her age. And clearly John was kind of a predator who liked young girls. It wasn't long into their love affair when Leigh Ann discovered she was pregnant with John's baby. His wife found out and threw him out of the house, and then he was free to marry Leigh Ann in 1960. Leigh Ann and John continued to grow their family over the next 5 years while living in southwest England, but then it is rumoured that John got himself into some financial troubles at work. It is alleged that he defrauded his company out of $6,000. One of their neighbours reported that they saw John burning papers in his garden, and the police believed he had been trying to destroy all evidence of his fraud. When he felt like the authorities were onto him, John, Leigh Ann and their 5 children fled to Auckland, New Zealand. They didn't stay there long before deciding in 1969 to take off to Australia, where Leigh Ann wanted to pursue a music career. This time they left their 5 children, ranging from 9 months to 12 years, behind at a state-run orphanage. They just abandoned them there with no explanation or reason. For their daughter, Jane, who was just 3 years old when her parents dropped her off and then vanished, would later talk about the trauma in an interview with the NZ Herald. She said, "I remember always my brother and I, whenever we saw a taxi or an aeroplane, walking home from school, headed towards where we lived, we would run, thinking it was our parents coming to pick us up. That went on for years. Can you imagine a 3-year-old just suddenly one day having no mother, no father? I couldn't imagine my 3-year-old just suddenly, one day asking, 'Where's my mother? Where's my father?' and there being no one there." It was not easy for their children, who were bounced around between various foster homes and back to being wards of the state. Because the government of New Zealand wanted to keep the 5 children together, they developed a program where a family home was built for the kids to live, while foster parents were rotated in and out of the home. Some foster parents were better than others at times. They suffered horrible abuse. All of this while Leigh Ann attempted to build her career as a cabaret singer. She wasn't very successful, so in 1972, she and John returned to New Zealand with new, fake names Leigh and John Martin. The authorities had been looking for them these past few years. They were facing charges of child abandonment, and the story of how they had just up and left their kids had been front-page news at one point. They kept a low profile, instead insisting that they were childless to anyone they became friends with. It wasn't until a decade later, in 1984, that John and Leigh Ann decided to try to reach out to their children and reconcile. I don't know how they thought this scenario was going to go. Maybe they hoped that their near-grown children would welcome them back with open arms, but that wasn't the case. They had been traumatized, and they had questions about why their parents had abandoned them and where they had been all these years, questions that John and Leigh Ann were not ready or willing to answer. The 19-year-old Martin and 15-year-old Jane met with their parents in hopes of getting some kind of closure, but Leigh Ann's response that they had simply decided to move to Australia to pursue her cabaret career did not sit well with them. Leigh Ann claimed that they had wanted to come back to New Zealand to get the kids as soon as she had made enough money, but she never did. It was a pathetic excuse, so Jane and the other children decided to report Leigh Ann and John to the authorities, plus tip off the media to their whereabouts. Worried they'd soon be arrested, Leigh Ann and John took off once again, this time returning to the UK. Eventually, in 1997, the couple would find themselves hiding in a small coal mining town called Beddow. After only a few short months of living in the South Wales community, John, who was now 67 years old, seemingly vanished. He had spent such a small amount of time living in this area that no one knew who he was or that he was ever really there. Leigh Ann began going by her middle name, Anne, and she quickly built herself a reputation. She would sometimes tell people that she had never been married or had children and outright lie, or sometimes she'd say that she once had a husband, but he was abusive to her and her children, and he was a womanizer who decided to up and leave her. No one really questioned her about her changing stories and contradictions. It was here, living in Beddow, that she would earn the nickname Mad Leigh. She was known around town for her theatrics. She'd befriend her neighbours and tell them all about her days of being a nurse and a famous cabaret singer. She liked to embellish. No one knew when she was telling a wild tale or being truthful. All they knew was that this was a woman who loved attention, whether it be positive or negative. She wore fishnet stockings at the most inappropriate of times and covered the walls of her home in photos of herself, including one from her cabaret years, when she felt she was in her prime. Leigh Ann would sometimes have boyfriends, including one who lived with her for a brief time named Derek Ellis, who was a retired fireman. No one seemed to notice her missing husband John, or the fact that each month his pension continued to be deposited into their joint account. John's name was still on most of the bills, but it was commonly accepted that this alleged abusive man must have run off with some other woman, leaving poor Leigh Ann to pick up the pieces on her own. In 2000, Interpol was able to track Leigh Ann down to let her know that her son, Martin, had taken his own life. I'm not quite sure why. If they were able to finally find her, they wouldn't continue to pursue charges. Maybe it was because the children were now adults, so they didn't see the point in moving forward with child abandonment charges. After learning her son had died, Leigh Ann decided to reach out to her daughter Jane, and in that conversation for the very first time, Leigh Ann told Jane that her father John was dead and that she had never loved him. Jane was already grieving the untimely death of her brother Martin and didn't have time for her mother's drama. She so hung up on her, and that was the very last time they would speak. While she was horrible to her offspring, Leigh Ann was known to be very friendly, outgoing and social with her neighbours. So she would often invite friends over for a glass of wine, where she would recall stories about being a famous singer and a model in Australia and her woes about her abusive womanizer husband, John, who had up and left her. She also often talked about a plastic medical skeleton, like one you would see at a doctor's office or in a science classroom, that she had kept as a keepsake from her days of working as a nurse. Sometimes this skeleton sat in her garden, sometimes she would keep it in her home, sometimes in the shed. One of her best friends, a woman named Leigh Ann, would recall having a drink with Leigh Ann one day at her home when she mentioned the skeleton and how she had plans to move it to the Etek. When Leigh Ann was questioned about why she was always going on about this fake medical skeleton, Leigh Ann replied, "All will be revealed. My darling's an answer that disturbed Rian." Still, she kind of brushed it off. Leigh Ann was an odd character. And then around 2015, she was diagnosed with brain cancer, and her health began to deteriorate quickly. The once dazzling and flamboyant Leigh Ann, who referred to everyone she met as darling, was now a shell of her former self. She knew that death was knocking on her door, and she had not achieved all of the things she had wanted to. But that was okay, because she had one final big reveal that would only happen once she had passed away. Just a few months before the cancer took her, Leigh Sabine allegedly told a hairdresser, "People are going to talk about me after I have gone. I could be famous." And when the hairdresser asked her why that was, she casually replied, "Because of the body in the bag again." This was nervously laughed off by the hairdresser, who believed she was being sarcastic. Leigh Ann had a caretaker near the end of her days named Lynn Williams, and she was adamant that the skeleton she had kept in her shed should be moved to the attic prior to her death. Lynn joked that she hoped it wasn't an actual body, and Leigh Ann responded with, "You never know," with a smile. No one knew when she was joking or being serious, so again this statement was brushed off. Leigh Ann passed away at the end of October 2015 from brain cancer. Her children would never get the answers they had so desperately wanted to know regarding why their mother just abandoned them one day. She had taken those details to the grave with her. But she did have one final surprise to reveal. On November 24th, 2015, approximately 25 days after Leigh Ann had died, two of her best friends, Ryan Lee and Michelle James, were sharing memories about her over a cup of coffee. One of them brought up Leigh Ann's medical skeleton and how it was often a topic of discussion. And they thought, wouldn't it be funny to use this skeleton to play a prank? They'd bring it out and put it on one of the neighbours' doorsteps, ring the doorbell, and all have a good laugh. Leigh Ann had requested the skeleton be moved to her attic, but unfortunately, it hadn't been done before she had died, so it was left sitting under a plotting table in the communal garden, wrapped up in plastic. So they went out to the garden and began to cut through the layers of plastic sheeting around the skeleton, when suddenly they were hit with the worst smell either had ever encountered. It was the smell of decomposition, and as the plastic was unwrapped, it revealed not a fake plastic skeleton, but a partially rotting dead body. They screamed, dropped the body, and ran to call the police about what they had just uncovered. When investigators responded, they confirmed that the fake skeleton was a nearly perfectly preserved body that had been chemically mummified by being wrapped in more than 40 layers of plastic, roofing felt, and shopping bags. The body had been so well preserved that they were able to determine whoever this man was had drunk alcohol shortly before he died, but would have been below the legal driving limit. The body appeared to be that of a white middle-aged male who had a receding hairline. He was about 5'D" tall, wearing Mark Spencer pajamas and a gold signet ring on one of his fingers. When they searched their database for missing people in the area who matched this description, they found none. They also compared the victims' DNA to those they had in their system, and none came back as a match. The police had no idea who this murdered man could have been or how he became wrapped up in plastic and left in the garden. When an autopsy was conducted, the cause of death was listed was blunt force trauma to the head, but they had no idea what the murder weapon could have been. There was none found at the scene. Though the police couldn't confirm the identity of the body just yet, rumors quickly began to swirl that it could be Leigh Ann's husband, John. Over the years, Leigh Ann had made jokes about killing her husband and how that medical skeleton could be real. But everyone thought she was joking. Now, it didn't seem all that funny. Approximately 3 weeks after the body was discovered, there was a breakthrough in the case. A relative of John's came forward to provide the police with a DNA sample, and when a comparative analysis was done, it came back as a match. The skeleton in the garden was John Sabine. He had not run away with another woman as Leigh Ann had suggested. There was also no reason to think that he had been abusive towards her, as she had made everyone believe no calls or reports of abuse filed with the police. Now that the mystery of John's whereabouts had been solved, the police wanted to figure out how he was killed, but he had been hidden away for 18 years, so it wasn't going to be easy. Then they received a phone call from a woman named Valerie Chalkley, who had been friends with both Leigh Ann and John back in the 90s. She had heard about the discovery of John's body and had quite the story to share. During a phone call with Leigh Ann back in 1997, Valerie asked if she and John were still together. She hadn't heard from either of them in so long and joked that she thought they may have killed each other by now. That's when Leigh Ann surprised her with a response of, "It's funny you should ask. I have killed him. I hit him over the head with a stone frog which was at the side of the bed." Just as the others had done when Leigh Ann had made a strange remark, Valerie brushed it off as a joke, but now it was clear she had not been joking. What was this stone frog she had mentioned, which she had kept at the side of her bed? Since Leigh Ann had passed away, many of her belongings had been distributed to her friends or simply tossed away because she didn't have any known family members to give them to. Luckily, Leigh Ann's friend Michelle had taken an interest in a heavy stone frog she had seen sitting beside Leigh Ann's bedside and decided to take it home. The frog, which was now sitting in her living room, had a protruding eye and hind leg that lined up perfectly with John's fractures. She had quite literally killed her husband by hitting him in the head with a stone frog and then wrapping his body up tightly with over 40 layers of plastic and pretending he was a fake skeleton from her nursing days. It was shocking to those who thought they were her friends, but not to those who knew how cold she could be, like her children.